Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers, de pays étrangers.
This is the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast. I am Jesse Martineau. Now, this episode is actually a really special one for Mike and I. We've known for some time that we wanted to do a holiday show. It was just a matter of who we wanted to ask to come talk about some of the Franco-American holiday traditions. And while Mike and I may not be always on the same page on everything, we usually are, and we certainly were with this decision. We both absolutely agreed that we needed to ask Juliana L'Heureux to return to the podcast, and we were thrilled when she agreed to come back on the show. The first interview with Juliana was actually the very first thing Mike and I ever recorded. It wasn't the first thing we released, but we actually did record our interview before we even recorded what we would call episode 0. Juliana L'Heureux is a freelance writer who publishes news, blogs, and articles about Franco-Americans and French culture. She has written about the culture in weekly and bi-weekly articles for over 30 years, and she is the person behind the Franco-American News and Culture blog, which listeners to our news segment will know I talk about all the time. So, Juliana, thank you so much for coming back on the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Well, merci beaucoup. Joyeux Noël. Merry Christmas.
Yes. Now let's start with that, actually, because you have written an article, which I thought was really interesting, about the French word for Christmas, Noël. Maybe you tell us about that.
Well, yeah, I became quite captivated by this. I mean, maybe I'm just a nerd, but, people don't really like to understand, the origin of words, but I became really curious because my husband and I, we've traveled a lot.
Sure.
And we lived in the Philippines when he was in the Navy. And so it became clear to me that Noël is the French word for Christmas, and it's also probably the most beautiful word that means only Christmas. So it doesn't mean anything else. And the reason I say that, and I did a little research for this particular podcast because I wanted to be sure, I looked it up again just to be sure that I'm on the right page. Now, of course, we know in English, Merry Christmas. It means have a happy Christ Mass. It goes back to the tradition, in Roman Catholicism of going to Mass.
Sure.
Happy Christ Mass. So Merry Christmas means Merry Christ Mass. And then, of course, you have some of your Polynesian languages, which are incredibly beautiful. And like in Hawaiian, Mele Kalikimaka. Excuse me, Hawaiians. It's Mele Kalikimaka. And that they are so beautiful when they say that, and it just means Merry Christmas. If you didn't know,
sure,
you wouldn't know it. But when you're there, they have. I don't know if you've ever been to Hawaii, but they certainly do beautiful decorations around Christmas. We lived in the Philippines, and the word was Maligayang Pasko. Another long word, just means Merry Christmas. Lots of letters, beautiful. Beautiful word, but it's really long. And then if you go to the Romance languages, and of course French is one of the 5 Romance languages, but if you go to Spanish, it's Feliz Navidad, and that means happy birth. Literally means a happy birth. In Italian, it's Buon Natale, and if you're ever in Italy on Christmas Eve, so help me. I mean, it is Buon Natale. It's so joyous and full of expression, but it also means happy birth. Then I went and looked up Romanian, because that's another Romance language.
Sure.
And that one was very strange to me. I don't think I can pronounce it correctly, but it's like Crocium Fericit. And that's Romanian. And then in Portuguese, again, we go back to Feliz Natal, which means happy birth. In German, it's 2 very long words, and I'm sorry to my German friends, but it looks like it's Fröhlich Weihnachten. But I'm trying to make the point that all those words mean Merry Christmas in all these different languages, but in French, it's a universal 4-letter word, Noël. Now, how did that happen? That's what I wanted to know. Why is that word so special? And it's universally known as Christmas. It doesn't have to be translated.
Sure.
So I started to think about that, and so I started in the meantime collecting anything that had Noël on it. Christmas cards, ornaments, area rugs, anything that had Noël. I filled my house with it at Christmas. So, and people began to give me gifts that had Noël on the gift. And So that was special, too, and I really appreciated that. You know, in Christmas you have, of course, in French, the Chants de Noël, which are the Christmas carols. And the Christmas carols, when they're sung in French, will bring tears to Franco-Americans' eyes, especially Oh Holy Night. All of the Christmas carols are incredibly beautiful. And that Christmas tree is an arbre de Noël. And, of course, everyone loves that dessert, the bûche de Noël, which is the Christmas dog. I mean, that is so delicious. But the word Noel, it just leaps right out at you. So I started thinking more about this, and I tried to find, you know, it's a big, long word for studying the origin of words called etymology, the origin of words, and I absolutely could not find an origin to Noel. There are a lot of different theories, but it seems to go back to a Celtic word that simply meant night, like the nighttime.
Sure.
And I didn't really buy that so much. I said, I'm sure it's a Celtic word. I'm not going to argue with these wordsmiths. But I started to think about the fact that in biblical definitions, back into the Old Testament, in Genesis, everything that referred to God had an E-L on it, like the angels, A-N-G-E-L, and like the archangels, Raphael, E-L, Archangel Michael, E-L, Gabriel, E-L, and of course Jesus, whose birth we celebrate at Christmas, is Emmanuel. And I said, you know, that E-L is really significant in the word Noel, particularly because the French, in the French language, they pay particular attention of putting that, you know, that hyphen above the letter E. It's called
the two dots. Yeah.
Yeah. And that means when you put that above a vowel, that it's almost like creating a separate syllable for that word. It's not just an accent. It's almost like a separate syllable for that letter. So it's not Noel, like if it was the name of someone, you might say Noel. No, it's Noel because of that accent. So this is the theory according to me.
I like this.
I really believe that Noel is a Celtic word, but it goes back to meaning the birth of God or night of God. Because you have with Feliz Navidad, you have the N-A or your N-O would be N-A, you know, it could, or you had some other references to Natal. So I'm going to go and say it means night of God. Sure. I really do. And I think that's one of the reasons the word is just so magical. It conveys the spiritual side of Christmas and the joyous side of Christmas, all in 4 letters. So I have a lot of fun with that word, and thank you for listening to my little course about it. But I really do fill up my hand. And sometimes I don't put a few of the Noels away. I actually leave them up.
That's awesome. Now, you also have written about the phrase "le fête de Noël." Now, what is a fête de Noël, and what might one see at a fête de Noël?
That would just be the celebration of Christmas, fête. And sometimes in the French language, it's les fêtes. It means all the holidays.
Gotcha.
Just les fêtes. Even your birthday can be les fêtes. So le fête de Noël would be celebration of Christmas. And, of course, this being Christmas Eve, as I understand it, that the Franco-Americans usually celebrate a réveillon, which is the night, Christmas Eve gathering of families. Christmas is so special for Franco-Americans because it means the coming together of families. And, of course, the birth of the Holy Family is Christmas. And the Franco-Americans will create a family reunion around Christmas celebrations. It used to be, you know, in the days before people were so mobile and lived so far apart, that they would always gather at Christmas Eve with their Franco-American families, and they would eat the Tourtière, which is, you know, the traditional French-Canadian meat pie. And that tradition goes back to the days in the Roman Catholic Church where people would sacrifice eating meat before Christmas as a sacrifice for the birth of the Savior. It was symbolic. And then they would break that fast by eating Tourtière on Christmas Eve after midnight mass.
Hey.
And so that became quite the tradition. And that continues today, that families gather and they share their Tourtières as a symbol of family traditions. And sometimes now eating the Tourtière is a New Year's tradition or it's a Christmas Day tradition. And in our family, we actually serve it with as an appetizer for Thanksgiving dinner, something you can have, in mid-morning before you eat, like at 1 or 2. We usually have an earlier dinner. So we do it almost any time of year. But on Christmas, it's really a tradition. I think you have a link to the recipe page on my Main Writer website.
We do,
because there are dozens. Yeah, there are dozens of Tourtière recipes on that site. So anyone who would like to check that out could just pick one. But the essence of a Tourtière is that it is a spicy meat pie. It's made usually with ground meats, sometimes a combination of meats. Can be a combination of pork and beef, but it could also be veal and beef, or it can be fowl, like pheasant.
Sure.
And pork. A lot of people, over the years have created their own special recipe, but in our family, we do the traditional beef with pork, and we simmer it until the meat really starts crumbling. I mean, probably about 3 hours.
Wow.
And then it gets really crumbly, and that's great. And that's when we add the spices. And in our family, we add cinnamon and cloves and salt and pepper. And over the years, we've actually come around to adding some minced garlic. We really found that we really like that with the cinnamon and the cloves. It's really delicious. And then we create a little thickener for that meat with a cooked mashed potato. We cook a potato and we mash it with butter, and we put that in with the meat, and that's sort of a thickener. And then we put that in a pie crust. And today, of course, it's so much easier because you buy those marvelous roll-out pie crusts, and it's so easy. And then you just put the meat in that, cover the top with the top crust, and then you always remember to poke holes because there's going to be a lot coming out of that. Don't forget to poke the holes in the crust. And we put it in the oven at around 400 degrees for about 35 minutes. And when it comes out, everybody's waiting to eat it. And what we serve, what I started doing over the years is serving Tourtière with a variety of relishes. A lot of Franco-Americans just like traditional relishes like pickles and butter or ketchup, and those are sort of traditional. But I started serving like a little variety of relishes, like green tomato relish and vinegar beets on the side, cucumber salad that's mixed with vinegar. I put a variety out, almost like a little smorgasbord.
That's awesome.
Right, if you take a piece of the Tourtière, and then you can, put several relishes on it and taste the different flavors. So that's been my contribution to the culture in our family. But the Tourtière for Noël is just an absolute tradition. And if you ever run out of something to talk about with Franco-Americans, just say, so tell me, what kind of food does your family make? And you'll be able to have an hour's worth of discussion on that.
That is awesome. Yeah, it's funny. In my family, we've gone to the Daughters of Isabella. It's like the woman's equivalent of the Knights of Columbus.
Right.
At least in Manchester, they make tons and tons and tons. So we buy tons and tons. So we'll have it for Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, on to forever because we just stock it up for months. It kind of just hangs around. It's awesome.
Right. Yeah. Actually, a really nice Christmas gift. Maybe a hostess gift, I should say. Invited to an open house is to bring a family recipe for Tourtière that has a potpourri with cheesecloth with your own personal spices in it. So they can make the recipe with your family spices. I've done that for open houses and so forth. And that's been well received. And even with the family, that they really enjoy getting that. So that's a good idea, too. So, it's just, and as I see that Tourtière is becoming more popular, I actually see recipes for it in other in mainstream recipe magazines now. So I think it's catching on.
No, that's awesome.
400 years, it's catching on.
Now, I'm curious. I mean, if you don't know, that's cool. But do you know has the recipe changed over time? I know you said that they started doing it as a kind of a way to break the fast, that kind of thing.
No, it has not. That's an absolutely excellent question. Yes, it has evolved. The history of the Tourtière, well, the French tradition back in France, of course, has always been prepare meals in a casserole or a pie. But the French colonists in the 1700s, they have such a short growing season, and they wanted to be sure that they grew enough wheat so they could have bread for the winter. They would make the flour out of the wheat, but the growing season was really short, and the seeds were so precious. But when they planted their fields for the wheat, these flocks of birds came down and ate the seeds, which was devastating. Yeah. And these birds were called tourterelles. Okay. I think they were carrier pigeons, but the French called them tourterelles. So, in the interest of saving their wheat, the farmers, les habitants, the farmers shot the birds out of the sky. Then they realized after that the feathers, these birds had some very elegant tail feathers. The feathers were at that time very, very popular in Europe in ladies' fashions, hats and brooches. So they actually found a market for the feathers, which made the birds even more valuable for them to keep rather than throw the birds away. So then what did they do? They figured they would eat the meat. So they carved the meat up into tiny pieces, and they cooked it to death like you do the meat for the tourtière.
Right, yeah.
And they cooked it with different spices, and that's how the evolution of the name tourtière came from, that experience of survival, really. Their survival depended on them being able to harvest a wheat crop, and then they were able to market the feathers, and it seems rather cruel today, of course, because we have access to so much wheat and flour, but they did not.
Sure.
And their survival. So they then made a little money on the sale of the feathers, selling them, I guess, to a merchant, and learned to make the pies from the meat. So they saved that, and the meat cooked like that lasted a while, especially in the cold weather. So it was a meal that did well over time, didn't need any special maintenance or refrigeration because they already had cold weather. That's how it evolved. But of course, then the birds became completely extinct, unfortunately. The tradition continued, so that's when they started to use venison, became very popular. So they would make the pies out of venison and mix the venison sometimes with, they didn't have access to beef so much, so more pork, venison and pork, or just venison. The tradition became beef and pork because they didn't always have a season where they could get enough venison. So it's mostly beef and pork, but you will hear many Franco-American families say that they use veal and pork, or veal and beef. You will hear some have even started using a ground fowl with beef, like ground turkey, to try to keep the fat content down. But I will tell you that my friend Muriel Poulin always said, you can't have a tasty tourtière unless you have fat in it. You can't. It's not the same. So you wanna have some fat content in your tourtière, and that's Christmas, that's Noël. So
absolutely.
That's something you want to. We do put butter in our tourtière just before we put it in the oven. But there's so many recipes on that site. I think that any of the listeners could find one that matches with what their family might have prepared over the years. So good luck, and I'm sure that I think we should all go back to that tradition. It's such a lot of fun to tell the story. It's such a family, it unites all families. It really does. It unites all families. So it's a celebration in and of itself. So I think that's something I hope that my children will continue to do, and I hope you continue to do it with your families as well.
Absolutely. Now, I think one thing that's cool, first of all, letting them know where that word comes from is super interesting. Mm-hmm. And I've always found it kind of interesting because where you are, seemingly, where you grew up in New England kind of determines what you call it, or maybe, because I know we just called it pork pie. My parents growing up called it tourtière. They had never heard of tourtière until I started doing this podcast, in fact. So
really?
Yeah. So it was just what they grew up with, calling it tourtière. So is everybody in Maine just call it tourtière for the most part?
Almost, yes. Of course, pork pie, yes.
Sure.
But, yeah, almost everyone calls it tourtière. And, of course, depending on your French accent.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I hear tourtière more than I hear pork pie, but it is synonymous. I even know most people don't make it entirely out of pork, but the purists probably do.
No, that's awesome. No, I do want to
you can try a couple of, it's a lot of fun if you do 2 or 3 tourtières, and, make them different with different spices and with different meat combinations. They're always delicious.
No,
always.
No question. Absolutely. Now, I do want to touch on a couple of other kind of fun traditions. And what about the heirloom ornament exchange, which I thought was pretty cool?
Over the years, we all have those treasured ornaments, and Franco-Americans are all about, family, and so we've really come to try to create an ornament that we share with our family every year. We can make it out of pieces of Christmas cards, particularly now that you have so many beautiful opportunities to frame Christmas cards,
sure.
Pictures, and make them ornaments. So we have done little tiny miniature family photos that we've made into ornaments, and they go on the tree, and we exchange those among ourselves each year. So we make something special. Always date these ornaments if you use a picture or whatever it is. So if you make something by hand, decoupage, an ornament, I hope that people will remember to date them. But we don't. I mean, I'm guilty of it too.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Try to go back and date them so the family knows when they were created and by who.
How about the family quilts? We discussed that.
Oh, yeah. We have a tradition that we've tried to build on over the years, and that is if we take something special in our family, like an old quilt, and we can embroider something on it, like this was Meme's quilt, and make a square.
Gotcha.
And different pieces of clothing from some of our cherished vintage closets, and then put that together as a family heirloom. Yes, we have one of those quilts, and it took a long time to make it because it took a long time to collect the appropriate squares and what they
sure.
meant. But it's a great family heirloom that everyone can participate in. But in the end of the day, it only creates one quilt. So.
Yeah, right.
But so we want to make sure it's was probably passed from one of the one generation to another. That's just a marvelous family tradition, and if you can get some quilters to help you, all the better. Some people have actually made a project out of cutting the squares, saying, I want a square from, Aunt Louise, and I want a square from, Meme Moore,
sure.
And then hiring a quilt maker to actually make the quilt. That is great because then it has a professional touch. But we did our own quilts, but some
That's
people
awesome.
do. Yeah, I think it's a great thing to do.
For sure. And you also noted that Christmas, holidays, really good time to update everybody's genealogical records, which is kind of fun. You can exchange all that.
Yeah, there's always a new person to add. There's always a new person to add, and we can't forget about keeping the generations current for the future.
Absolutely.
So, Franco-American genealogies are just amazing because of the detailed records that were kept on births and deaths through going back 400 years. The genealogical records for Franco-Americans are more accurate than any you'll find in Europe because of the different wars that destroyed so many churches where all the records were kept. But in North America, those records were protected. Very few were lost, and many of them were actually transcribed. Like, there would be a notary that would go around from parish to parish and actually rewrite some of these records so they could have a backup copy. I mean, that's how much detail was put in to keeping the records. So that's why Franco-American genealogies are amazing. And anyone who's really interested in connecting to that, it's a gift if you have a Franco-American in the family, because it really will take your family back to as far back as the first ancestor with tremendous accuracy. But we also want to remember about current generations.
Absolutely.
It's easy to just sit down and say, hey, you know what, in this family table around Le Réveillon here, celebrating Joyeux Noël, we might have 5 generations right here that we could document that probably aren't in the databases. Or if they are, they might not be accurate.
Sure.
So I would highly, highly recommend. That's a tremendous gift. You don't have to think back 10 generations. You can be thinking about 5 generations right in your own home. So I would encourage people to please do that, because it's getting more and more difficult to have one source for a lot of data anymore.
Sure.
People are so mobile.
No, that's fun.
Yeah.
Now,
keep good at that.
we could talk about this forever.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially families. Families. Talking about families is it's a lot of fun. Just a lot of fun. Noel is a time for family reunions, and used to be that the family reunions were a Réveillon right after midnight mass when the Tourtière came out, but now because of extended families and such mobility, the family reunions around Christmas can begin the 1st of December, or they can go all the way through, not every day, but I'm saying that people plan them through the weeks before Christmas and even up until New Year's Day. New Year's Day is another great day for a family reunion, but it's all in the festival, les fêtes. Les fêtes is the whole experience. Noel meaning Christmas, Réveillon meaning Christmas Eve, but les fêtes is the whole experience.
That's
and it's very joyous, very, very, very joyous time.
Okay.
So it's always a pleasure to get together with family during les fêtes.
All right, but before we close, I have to bring up something that you alluded to earlier, because it happens to be my all-time favorite Christmas carol, the Minuit Chrétien.
Minuit Chrétien.
Now,
oui.
now, it's cool because in the church I go to, the midnight mass at St. Joseph's Cathedral, actually historically an Irish church, obviously most of the songs are all in English. Every year at midnight mass, they make sure to sing that particular song in French, which is so awesome to me.
It brings chills. It brings chills, and you just can't translate it. I mean, the English words are lovely, but when you hear and understand them in French, they're awesome. And I just can't say enough about the emotional impact of Minuit Chrétien in French. So I'm glad to hear that's still a tradition at St. Joseph's Cathedral.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, Oh Holy Night, good song, but it's so much better in French.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, so thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much again for joining us on this podcast. This has been an awesome tour of some Franco-American Christmas traditions. I hope you have an awesome Christmas, a great New Year's. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, but I would also just throw out a challenge to your listeners.
Please.
I would like to know if anyone else has a different understanding of the origin of the word Noel. I would love to respect.
You got it.
Okay?
We'll make sure to get
Noël.
that. That's awesome. Joyeux Noël.
Minuit chrétien, c'est l'heure solennelle où l'homme Dieu descendit jusqu'à nous pour effacer la tâche originelle et de son père arrêter le courroux. Le monde entier tressaille d'espérance à cette nuit qui lui donne sauveur. Peuple à genoux, attends ta délivrance. Noël, Noël, voici le Rédempteur. Noël, Noël, voici le Rédempteur. Le Rédempteur a brisé toute entrave, la la terre est libre et le ciel est ouvert. Il voit un frère où n'était qu'un esclave, l'amour uni ce qu'enchaîne le fer, qui lui dira notre reconnaissance, c'est pour nous tous qui naît, qui souffre et meurt. Peuple debout, chante ta délivrance. Noël, Noël, chantons le Rédempteur. Noël, Noël, chantons le Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair, to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never dies, our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josée Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at joseevachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.